Can video games turn children violent? We didn't know before, but a new meta-analysis by the EPA reveals that we still don't actually know. So we're going to talk about some attempts to regulate violent video games instead, today on episode 4 of Tiny Voices. For about as long as I can remember, there's been a debate about the harmful effects of violent video games on society, and it's been the academic equivalent of a truck spinning its wheels in the mud, just always going back and forth, tit for tat. A new study will come out demonstrating a clear correlation between consumption of violent media and aggression, and it's "we must ban this sick filth to protect the children." And then another one will come out with the exact opposite premise. Rinse and repeat. It's a process so consistent and rhythmic you could mistake it for a metronome. And the big problem in this whole debate is that it's pretty easy to demonstrate correlation, but a causative link, i.e. X causes Y, is much harder to prove. And so, like clockwork, we have the latest entry in this ongoing saga. Cue the EPA's recent press release on their task force report, in which they poured over 150 pieces of research and multiple meta-analyses to come to the conclusion that there's a link between playing violent video games and aggression. The operative word there being link. In other words, we found correlation. Again. And hey, before you say I'm being dismissive because I love video games and I have an obvious bias here, which I do, that's not the reason I roll my eyes at that statement. I roll my eyes at that because it's not new and it doesn't further our understanding of this issue. It basically boils down all the research we've seen in recent years down to something we already knew. There's some vague, poorly defined connection. Maybe they do cause aggression, maybe they don't. We can't be totally certain, but we do know there's a correlation there. And again, tit for tat, 228 scholars rallied around an open letter written to the EPA criticizing their task force and their analyses. So it's right back to square one on that front. So I thought, instead of focusing on that frustrating slice of academia related to our medium, this week I wanted to look at an important Supreme Court case which stymies the tide of legislation ushered in by moral panic. That case was Brown v. the Electronic Merchants Association. First, before we even go any further into this episode is primarily going to apply to the US and to US law, so this is going to be a pretty America-centric episode. Alright, so first, before we get into the case itself, there are some things that we have to understand about the history of the industry. Prior to the early 90s, the video game industry in the US was largely unregulated. October of 1992 marked the beginning of the end for that. In fact, that 1 month turned out to be among the most influential in the course of the medium's history. First, on October 8, 1992, Midway's Mortal Kombat was released. 1 week later, on October 15th, Sega's Night Trap came out on the Sega CD. Both games cultivated a legacy of controversy for their graphic and gory content. At the time, they were some of the most violent games on the market, and if we're being honest, they weren't terribly remarkable aside from their extreme subject matter. Street Fighter II predates Mortal Kombat by a year and was by far the more technical fighter, and Night Trap was kind of a mediocre FMV slasher game. So why were the back-to-back releases of these two games so important? Well, because that's the kind of stuff that kids of the 90s loved. Dark, gritty, edgy. Mortal Kombat was something that kids of that era hadn't seen before, and again, it was transgressive in how gory it was. If you were a kid back then, it was cool. There was nothing else out there like it. And that's exactly what Senator Joe Lieberman's chief of staff's son thought. To quote a BBC piece on this subject, Bill Anderson, a former chief of staff to Senator Joe Lieberman, was asked by his son to buy Mortal Kombat. When Anderson saw the game, he showed it to Lieberman, who was appalled by it. End quote. Lieberman set out on a moral crusade to warn the public that their children were being exposed to the corrupting influence of violent video games, and it was happening right under their noses. And people listened. Parents listened. The United States Senate listened. By 1993, the threat of government regulation loomed over the video game industry, and the Senate gave the industry an ultimatum. Regulate yourselves, or we'll do it for you. Fearing an unprecedented backlash in the form of a strict regulatory body run by the federal government, several major players in the video game industry banded together to create a self-regulatory board known as the Electronic Software Rating Board, the ESRB. The ESRB is responsible for playing through newly released video games and assessing their content based on criteria such as depictions of sex, drug use, and violence. The ESRB uses these criteria to rate games on a scale denoting which age groups a given video game might be appropriate for. Early childhood, kids to adults, which was later renamed to everyone in 1998, teen, mature, and adults only. With the ESRB in place, there is an implicit agreement between the ESRB, retailers, and parents. Parents would use the ESRB as a guideline for what games might or might not be inappropriate to buy for their children, and the retailers would respect those ratings and not sell M-rated games to minors. None of that, especially that last part, can be mandated by federal or state law. It's more or less just a de facto convention, and not one that is strictly legally enforced. The only reason that it works in theory is because, although GameStop has no legal obligation not to sell Mortal Kombat to Timmy the 8-year-old, the ESRB was formed by a collective of publishers and major players in the industry, and they could throw their weight around if need be, because the looming threat of a federal regulatory body would have been the greater of two evils, so it's to their own benefit to self-police. Still, that was seen as a stopgap solution, a half measure. For example, in Indianapolis, an attempt was made to distance arcade machines with violent content from non-violent arcade machines, while also restricting people under the age of 18 from playing violent arcade games. This law was eventually struck down by a federal judge. That was in the year 2000. A pattern of legislation against violent video games being introduced and subsequently struck down at the federal level continued on and off for a few years. In 2005, the legislative landscape changes a little bit. We see a familiar pattern, but this one ends in a much more definitive way. That year, California passed AB 1179, which required anyone purchasing a violent video game to be over the age of 18. This law also demanded extra labeling in addition to the ESRB rating printed on the game's packaging. The law used a version of the Miller test to determine whether or not the content of a game would be deemed objectionable. The Miller test, by the way, is a three-pronged test used by the Supreme Court to determine whether or not speech can be labeled obscene, and it was established in the landmark First Amendment Supreme Court case of Miller v. California. The three prongs of the Miller test are: 1, would the average person operating under contemporary standards find the work salacious? 2, is it patently offensive? And 3, does the work lack serious artistic or scientific value? Now, all three prongs of this test are obviously subjective, but in order for a work to be labeled obscene using the Miller test, all three criteria have to be fulfilled. Anyway, following the passing of AB 1179, the Entertainment Software Association announced they would be suing the state of California for First Amendment violations. They also filed an injunction which was upheld by U.S. District Judge Ronald White. California Governor Schwarzenegger, who signed AB 1179 into law, appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The appellate court affirmed Judge White's decision. Schwarzenegger further appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. He further appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 2010, the Supreme Court started hearing arguments from Schwarzenegger and the recently formed Entertainment Merchants Association. A year later, in 2011, the Supreme Court voted 7-2 in favor of the Entertainment Merchants Association, affirming the decision of the lower courts and striking down the California law in question. Antonin Scalia delivered the majority opinion, stating, quote, California correctly acknowledges that video games qualify for First Amendment protection. The free speech clause exists principally to protect discourse on public matters, but we have long recognized that it's difficult to distinguish politics from entertainment and dangerous to try. He added that moral judgments concerning art are up to the discretion of the individual and that the government has no business making those types of moral judgments. Brown v. Electronic Merchants Association established a very important precedent that's crucial to the game industry today. This pattern of banning games on the basis of simple moral outrage and trying to legislate their corrupting influence, quote-unquote, is unconstitutional, as established by this case. This won't and this hasn't stopped alarmist fearmongers like Jack Thompson from peddling their rhetoric about how violent games need to be banned, but at the very least, this precedent secures the protected speech status of games as a medium. That's going to do it for episode 4 of Tiny Voices. Next week, I'm going to be out of town at PAX Prime. There will still be an episode up on Saturday, August 29th at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I don't have a lot of breathing room to work with this week since I leave on Thursday the 27th, so this one might be a little bit shorter and sweeter than the rest of these have been so far. Anyway, that's going to do it for tonight. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take it easy. Have a good one.